What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, talking about patch 14.5 coming to a server near you in about 1 week's time. We are branch cutting this tomorrow. That just means we're basically going to stop development on the patch in, well, as of time of recording, about 15 hours. We've gone through the sort of baseline checks for what we want to put into the patch, and unless something comes up from QA overnight, this is going to be what's in the patch. I'm going to keep numbers out of this, but overall, I'll spend this video talking about direction, why we're doing what we're doing, what I can remember of magnitude goals, and anyway, yeah, let's talk about what is in this patch and why. First, a quick preview of some longer-term work before we're talking about this patch itself. We've talked several times about a potential minor kit update to Galio to make him care more about health items. We have to be cognizant of his tank builds overall. We'd like him to still build AP a fair bit, so we have to be pretty careful about where the scalings all go, but ultimately trying to make him play a somewhat longer combat pattern, probably involving using his passive more than once in a rotation and not being as bursty. Now, that said, what I'm almost always seeing in high elo solo queue, at least in NA, is I'm seeing Shurelya's Rush or straight up full tank from Galio mid. I know in lower MMRs, you're seeing more Storm Surge, though that's not nearly as performant. But even regardless, Shurelya's is still a very squishy item. There's no health on it, whatnot, so all just to say that we are hoping for next patch, if not then the patch afterwards, that we'll get some kind of minor kit update to make him feel a bit better as a bruiser, not quite full AP, but still, flavored in the way that he's flavored. These are not necessarily planned, but things that we are aware of, and so we will probably do them in the coming patch or patches or months. Is Aatrox and Yorick are the two, I think, most standout fighters who are building lethality right now, and we can deliver some updates to make this look better. I have pretty good ideas directionally of what Aatrox and Yorick will need. I think these are going to be, in the Aatrox case, I think quite easy. In the Yorick case, I'm confident of a larger scope set of changes. We'll see how that will test out, though, but these are the kind of thing that I think we will probably do in the next little bit to get the incentives correct on these champions. One thing I want to kind of call out here is the overall balanced state between fighter and lethality items in general. I'm not going to claim that these items are perfectly tuned against one another, but I think they are very close when I look at what most fighters are building and what most fighters are performing on. When I think back to maybe a year and a half ago, we saw most assassins were building very heavy fighter. I can remember a ton of times of seeing Gore Drinker, Black Cleaver, Talon. I remember seeing a lot of that kind of build on Zed as well. Kiana would build like this sometimes. And so we've definitely had the other side where assassins are just fighters who one-shot you because their kit is one-shotty, but they also just get to have a bunch of health on it. And I've seen the opposite, where there's a bunch of fighters building pure lethality and turning into pretty mediocre assassins. Obviously, both states are bad. I don't know if I can tell you which state I think is worse overall for the game, but I do think that as of today, relative to maybe a year ago, I think we're in a much better state overall, where to be fair, I haven't dove into this very deeply, but from my cursory glance and recollection, I think we're actually pretty close overall in terms of Aatrox and Yorick are the primary outliers, and most of the rest of the roster, both on the assassin side and the fighter side, are building appropriate items, which makes me believe that the item systems are in a pretty good place. Again, there might be some individual outliers, and we can tune those, that's fine. But if it's only two champions who are significantly out of line here in terms of what their builds are emphasizing, then we're really close, and it's just two champions need kit updates, and then we're going to be fine here. So anyway, I think in the relatively short term, we can get some minor kit updates to Aatrox and York to make sure that they feel successfully rewarded for building a little bit tankier, but not full tank, and I think we can get there without too much difficulty. Anyway, that's the quick TLDR on longer term updates. There's other stuff farther down the road that we'll talk about when it comes time for it, but ultimately, yeah, things that I'm thinking about that we're probably going to do in the next couple of patches, or a little bit beyond that. Anyway, let's talk about what is in this patch itself. So first big thing is a suite of follow-up onto Rek'Sai. There were a few small bugs. There definitely was a lot of tuning to be done. We expected that the patch update would be about a about a 2% win rate lift. Obviously, we were wrong. Rek'Sai went down about 0.5% if you average across all ranks of play, between 1 and 0.5%, which means we still have this 2 and change percent win rate budget to deliver to Rek'Sai in the ways that feel best. And so we're generally going after some, nice bug fixes that are useful. This is being able to manually cancel your own queue. This is fixing the weird QR interaction that we couldn't ship to live, which is why we let you cancel out of your queue, which of course doesn't feel great. Some other stuff around your animations locking you out and whatnot. But that's going to be really minor. Obviously, it's always worth doing. Regardless of power impact, obviously that was always worth doing. But we're doing a bunch of stuff into animations and hit timing. Rek'Sai is a champion who came out in 2014. The timings on her auto attacks, the speed at which she animates, all that stuff is 10 years old, has never been updated, I'm pretty sure, ever since that point in time. And either our tools are better or I don't know what, but I retimed her animations. I retimed the point at which her model is going to cast hitting you in an auto attack and the Q animation. These are now differently timed, and additionally went in and overall sped up the speed at which she animates. So it's going to double dip where the animations of her Q and her basic attack are going to be faster, and the hit is going to be earlier on in the animation itself. So Rek'Sai will be a much snappier auto attacker. There's some buffs to her R overall. I ended up nerfing the R probably more than I should have. This ability has felt limp, and so I brought it back. And I thought I needed to nerf the E because of how much power we thought we were giving her with the regen and the dashes and whatnot, but we have the win rate budget to give a bunch more here. And so bumping up the E a little bit, primarily in the early game, so right now, Rek'Sai's power curve appears to be very slightly late game skewed. That was not an explicit goal. The goal was primarily around giving Rek'Sai a late game, but not necessarily trying to skew her towards it, just making sure that the late game actually felt pretty good. But I think her early game is a little bit too weak right now, and so these buffs are primarily aimed at the early game of Rek'Sai to bring up that early game, to bring up that early fighting, and so that hopefully she's going to feel a lot better as a damage champion. And our budget is about 2.5% worth of win rate. Rek'Sai is somewhat elite skewed. We expected this. Playing around tunnels is a pretty high mastery thing. Going in and out of combat is a pretty high mastery thing. Once she settles in, I'm sure she'll get a big pick rate spike from this patch's updates, so we can kind of measure long term if she's more or less elite skewed than before, and then remeasure as people get mastery on the sort of new version of the kit, which is not heavily changed, but it's changed some. And then we'll figure out if it ended up being more elite skewed or more normal skewed as a result. It doesn't really matter which way or not, but long term, in a balanced state, we want to see if Rek'Sai is going to feel, well loved by Rek'Sai fans overall. There's also a big kit update to Seraphine. I put a video up about this about 5 or so days ago, I think, 6 days ago. That was about why this was happening. Ultimately, Seraphine has a 6% win rate delta between her support, which is trash and is practically a must buff. And even if you do the optimal skill order max, she's still sub 49 on maxing W, which is not tragic. There's champions who are down below there, but I don't think Seraphine is meant to be a win rate constrained champion in support. Meanwhile, she's 6% win rate higher in bot lane, where she's practically a must nerf. She's a huge elo inflator, and so we have to bring these teams together. And so it was trying to find the right levers that would bridge the gap between these two roles, while also trying to make her funner to play in each case. Again, you can look at the video around that one, but largely it's around letting support Seraphine max whatever she wants, because there's a compelling reason why you'd max either any one of these permutations of abilities, trying to make bot lane Seraphine primarily a mage where Q and E are the optimal max, and again, trying to bring power budget in for where it needs to be. So overall minion damage is down. That's obviously farming bot lane, farming Seraphine skewed. Champion damage up, obviously strike power up to everything, and especially playing up the magier side of the playstyle as opposed to the enchanter side of the playstyle. She gets more move speed, she gets more missile speed. Missile speed, of course, is just basically damage up, of course, on the Q. Tweaking on Wmax versus Emax to make sure that Emax can be correct in more cases, potentially in almost all cases. And the expected target based on analysis we have done is that she's going to be about 51.5% win rate in bot lane and in support in low MMR. We expect there to be some low MMR skew for her support. We don't expect there to be a lot of low MMR skew for her in bot lane, but to me, 51.5 is a very reasonable win rate for Seraphine. I don't think she should be 50. I don't think she should be 53. I think 51.5 is very reasonable for bot Seraphine. So if we are on magnitude, we are very happy. And 51.5 low elo skewed for support is very reasonable. Sona is an example of a champion like this, and she's pretty inoffensive and a very reasonable, successful champion with that kind of MMR distribution and win rate. So if this is what we hit actually, this is what, again, we have come back from our analysis, then I'm very happy with this result and overall what's going on here. One thing I do want to take a very brief talk about was, though I am, again, not actually happy with how the point 21 or point 22, I think it's point 21, changes on Seraphine ultimately landed. We had to actually immediately pivot and do some more buffs and nerfs because her win rates were in a weird spot the immediate patch afterwards. Even after all these changes have settled down and we're, several months now beyond that point in time, and we can kind of like take a look at her overall pick rate and whatnot, she's actually more broadly played than before. There are actually more Seraphine players than they have been before. Because there are more total Seraphine players, her depth is a little bit shallower. She's still one of the more deeply played champions. Like Seraphine is a very broadly, widely played champion who is played more deeply than most champions. So she's like in the top right quadrant and has gotten broader over the last several months. Obviously she had like a quick spike in play rate on the first patch, like, oh, new kit update, let's try this. But she has maintained very high breadth. Actually, I believe it's actually her highest breadth in more than a year. So again, though I'm not happy with how everything landed, there is a very large community of Seraphine players who is still very happy to play Seraphine. I'm sure some people swapped out, some people swapped in. Overall, though, she has remained a very, very popular champion, which is good to see that she's still in an overall popular state. But of course, we can always do better. We can always make some improvements. And so trying to make improvements here with the update in this patch. Okay, now let's talk about what else is going into the patch itself. We're going to start with systems updates, which I think always makes sense. And so we are taking a swing at about half the ecosystem of support items overall. So, of course, there are 5 support upgrades. We know that some are going to be very hard bound to one another. So, for example, we know that every AP mage is going to go Zazax. It's the one item that triggers on you applying a spell to an enemy champion almost every time. It's the one item with an AP ratio. Zyra and Brand and Xerath and Vel'Koz and all these champs will just always go Zazax. From what we can tell, the overall power level of those champions is pretty much reasonable. Zyra and Brand themselves need some have needed some tweaks over time. We did some Zyra changes a little while back. Brand right now actually has the same win rate in mid lane and support. So and he still has like 10% or so of his play rate is in mid lane right now for Brand. So it's still like a moderately popular role for him. And so it's not like, oh, we just nerfed Zazax because Brand is still OP as a mid laner. And so, Brand needs changes no matter what, even if it's not Zazax itself. And so anyway, I think that Zazax as an item is totally retunable if we find that across the entire suite of AP supports who are also mid laners, if they all outperform at support, we can tweak Zazax as a way to globally affect this crew of champions, and we will get some movement and we can tune support versus mid lane, and that's very useful. When it comes to that, we can do that, and that's fine. Anyway, beyond that, we have Bloodsong, which is going to be very obvious on pretty much every AD champion. So I think there's a case where Pyke might go for like Celestial or something, but Pyke's going to build Bloodsong, Pantheon's going to build Bloodsong, Ashe and Senna are going to build Bloodsong. Right now, actually, Sona is better served going Bloodsong than Dreammaker, and this is why we've nerfed Bloodsong for ranged, I think, for 2 to 3 patches now, and why we're going to do a very light buff to Dreammaker, because at a certain point, these champions are probably moving in the other direction and getting something else instead. The other thing here is there is a very, very large win rate gap between Solstice Slay and Celestial Opposition, specifically if you look at tank supports. In a case like Maokai, where he's really, really, really movement speed skewed, he just really always wants Solstice Slay. But if you look at other champions like Thresh or Blitzcrank or a bunch of other tank supports like Leona and Nautilus, every single one of them performs better on Solstice Slay than Celestial Opposition. And it's anywhere between like 1.5 to 6% the win rate delta there. It's really, really large. And so in my mind, I think it's probably correct that Solstice Slay on average is the slightly better option. Again, on average, not in all cases. And if we get these win rate magnitudes, then that's going to be the case here. But the reason is that Celestial is the kind of item that is extremely generic. Every single champion can always use Celestial. And in fact, this item kind of tells you if you're feeding, go ahead and buy this. It's going to give you the ability to feed a little bit less. And if that item ever becomes omnipresent, I think the game gets worse, because you just have a class of champions that are suddenly unburstable, and you just kind of invalidate 20% of the target selection for assassins, which honestly kind of sucks. I just think the gameplay is overall pretty bad, as Celestial is the default purchase for any wide swath of champions. I think that's actually incorrect overall. Now, in a world where we have 7 versions of Zazax and 7 versions of Bloodsong, and you make a ton more support items and you have more variation, sure, but Celestial can be reasonably used by every support subclass, and as such, it should never dominate choice because it's always in the choice structure. I hope that makes sense. Again, this item currently is very, very weak. I don't think it's correct on basically anyone at any point in time, so we're going to make that less the case, and it will be some champion's optimal support item, but we don't want to make it globally optimal, and so we're pretty hesitant here in buffing Celestial too much. That said, we're specifically buffing Celestial in its melee outputs, so one thing is the cooldown is going to give it shorter. That is a generic buff, but the other two buffs of the item are the slow potency and the slow duration on the shield breaking, which is very, very melee skewed. It's very Nautilus diving in, Leona diving in, etc. skewed, so should be reasonable in that regard. Solstice Slay, of course, just is overpowered. We're nerfing the cooldown, we're nerfing the move speed, and we're, for tanks at least, nerfing the amount of bonus health this item gives. Ultimately, we missed on magnitude last patch. The item ended up getting stronger to the tune of about 1.5%, so we're trying to walk most of that back, and then someone going for minus 2% in this patch. We're tweaking the heal, or the bonus health that the item grants, from instead of being percent max HP to being level scaling HP, which will make it a little bit better for enchanters, so Janna and Soraka might buy Solstice a bit more often. But I think it's not going to dominate choice too badly here, especially with the other nerfs going in, like the cooldown and the move speed potency. And then Dreammaker's getting a small buff here. So what I want to point out with the Dreammaker changes and the Solstice Slay changes is that we are pretty aggressively level skewing these items. So one thing to point out is that most supports don't get very far beyond level 13. And so when you see a tooltip that says, oh, this scales from like 50 to 175, you go, wow, that's a really, really, really big scaler. But when you realize they don't go to 18, they go to 13, it's like, oh, that goes from 50 to 110. You're like, oh, that's an item that scales from level 6 to like level 13 when the game ends. And yeah, it gets about twice as powerful. That's much more reasonable, right? And level 18 support is like entirely fake because you get a 45-minute game. So you will see kind of like fake scaling on the support items. I think letting them go to 18 is totally reasonable, right? If your support got to level 18, they have been long over capped on items, and letting their support item like keep up with those level scaling to me is more than reasonable to give them the theoretical option to scale late game. I think that is more than fine. But I'm specifically coming in here and trying to tap down on the early game spike of these items, and doing so a bit further than we did in the last patch, because I think supports do spike a little bit too hard early game. We'll see what happens here in terms of how this feels to play against. But one thing I've noticed actually, and this largely happened after the 14.3 changes from the previous patch, the one from, 3 weeks ago, is the pick rate of bot lane has actually heavily recovered. So one thing that actually happened in 14.1 is bot lane pick rate dropped a lot, as players were like, wow, I really can't play AD carries, I'm getting one shot by assassins, and supports have all the agency. And by, we're measuring it now in 0.3 and 0.4, and pretty much all the bot lane pick rate has recovered because it's not happening anymore. So it's actually very interesting. Now, certainly, like, we did some updates to AD carry items, right? We buffed Kraken Slayer, we buffed Static Shiv, we buffed Storm Razor, we buffed Terminus, we buffed Rageblade, and we nerfed a little bit of lethality items as well, right? So don't get me wrong, there were also a bunch of direct changes to the class of champions as well. But at this point in time, we're back at, I think, relatively long-term high pick rates for the role. Typically, AD carry is a very unpopular role in low elo specifically, and we are in a quite healthy spot worldwide for the class, and so it's really good to see that like a lot of the like plummeting pick rate of the role has recovered based on systemic updates to the class itself, but also surrounding classes that tend to prey upon AD carry. So those sort of systems have gone pretty well. You may have seen, for example, that there were some speculative changes to Navori quick blades in this patch. I elected to pull them out because upon seeing agency metrics and role selection metrics, was like, oh, actually, it looks like AD carry has recovered, or bot lane as a role has recovered, and so we don't need to further juice the role. We should be in a pretty good spot overall. Looking at champion winners, champion pick rates, it seems like we're in a pretty good spot for these champs, generally speaking. So overall, reasonably happy with where this is right now. Unfortunately, jungle is still quite unpopular. That's not a good thing. I think ultimately I did too many changes in 13.20. We should have taken less power out of the role and cared more about keeping the role as popular as it was, and that was a learning experience for me. We pivoted on a lot of the stuff in 13.21 back then, but as I get better at my job and understand more what's going on, and figure out what's the more important priorities, we probably should have left jungle a bit more OP than we did, because it wasn't worth sacrificing the role's popularity, because that is actually, I would argue, more important than the role's actual power level, is losing to your jungler being auto-filled. So that's something we will probably have to walk back at some point and figure out the right tactics for. Not promising this for any patch in the near future, but probably something that probably needs to happen at some point. Random things tangential to this war item update, but I want to talk about that here. So we are updating some tank items overall. The first thing that came in was actually a direct nerf to Frozen Heart. Right now, Frozen Heart is the most purchased tank item in the game. To me, this is very unreasonable. Certainly, one thing that happened is tank items lost a lot of ability haste, and so Frozen Heart is one of few very good first item ability haste items. So it might be that we need to re-add haste in some places to make sure that that choice opens up and feels good. That is a different investigation that you have to go after at some point and make sure that we have some good options here. Very valid to bring this up as a point. Regardless, Frozen Heart as the most built tank item feels very incorrect, considering it is specifically double skewed against auto attackers with the I always forget what it's called, like the Strength and Steel or Heart of Steel or whatever passive, which lowers damage per auto hitting you, and then also the attack speed aura. It just double hits auto attackers, which I mean kind of sucks to have an item that is default purchase that hates auto attackers. That seems too niche of a role for an item that is actually this broad. So Frozen Heart is going down. We are keeping all of its multipliers, such as, the actual multiplication on the, max health ratio into the damage reduction. Rock Solid, it's called. There we go. Not steal anything. Warden's Mail is made of metal. That's why my brain went there. Anyway, yeah. The Rock Solid thing isn't changing anyway. The percent attack speed or isn't changing anyway. So Frozen Heart as like a second or third item, quasi capstone is still the case. But it's -5 armor plus 100 gold cost to try to say Frozen Heart should be less good by itself, and more of the power budget is in the multiplicative nature of what the item does for you at second and third slot. It's a nudge. I expect that item to still be very popular, but it's a nudge. We're upping Sunfire Aegis to be a stronger item overall. This item got nerfed in the 14.1 update. Ultimately, it's a way to systemically buff tanks who aren't doing all that well. Hearthstone is getting buff here as well. We buffed Hearthstone a little bit in the previous patch. We're basically returning Sunfire Aegis's, I think, almost all of its stat, or actually all of its stats, to what it was in 1324. This item's still a little bit weak. Wave clear tanks are fine. There's definitely a weird discussion here, so I'm going to probably spend some time, I guess, because why not, talking about the position of tanks as a top lane role in League of Legends, because it's tough to know what the completely right call is here. So this is going to be me just kind of like yapping for a bit. Feel free to skip down to where you don't see this highlighted anymore, because it's kind of going to be me yapping. So on one extreme end, you have Divine Sunderer, which says tanks no longer lane. And that means after about 50 minutes in the game, tanks feel like they don't have a role anymore, and all they do is hide under the tower and then wait the team fight, and then they Malphite ult or they Ornn ult, and they, cool, I did my job, and they feel really, really bad to play because you only can play 1v1 for the first 1/3 of the game or so, because you get, minute 12 to minute 14, and then the game is over for you, and all you can do is wait and be passive and then team fight. That doesn't feel very good for tanks. But what it does do as a spectator sport is ensure that if you're playing a fighter, you have players with agency, they invade the enemy jungle, they go fight for objectives, they might set up tower dives, they might take turret plates, and you tend to see the Renekton's and Jax's and Camille's and whatever of the world have agency and get to push tanks in, and then that tends to be more exciting to watch as a spectator sport, League of Legends, than, well, if the alternative is true, the other hyper not okay version is tanks remain incredibly tanky and can't be killed in 1v1, in which case there's no reason to play Jax because you can't get a lead in top lane anyway, because Ornn or Malphite or Cassante or whoever can always wash every wave, is untower knifeable, is untradeable. He can't kill you, but he's so immovable that he's always going to be equal farm, and then guess what? You're just going to permanently weak side top lane. Why play a risky fighter when you can play a tank and only play for bot lane? And now I have Ornn in a team fight against instead of Jax in a team fight. Guess which teams of Phelios wins? It's the one with Ornn on it, right? That is the other stream that's also not great. That's, to be fair, specifically a pro-skewed thing, but it also will make top lane and solo queue very boring if you feel like, oh, my 1v1 skill test, right, I opted in to play Jax or Riven or Fior or Camille, and my top laner has no interaction. Right? They don't do very much damage. They can't fight me back. I can't fight them because they can't be killed. I can't tower to them because they're going to take too long to kill. So I don't have gameplay here, right? And so even the not spectator version, that also sucks. So in the case of Divine Sunder and Tanks Hate Life, tanks suck to play. They're not fun to play, but at least something happens in top lane. I'm not claiming this is good, to be clear. So obviously the correct version of this is somewhere in the middle ground, where tanks are not allowed to be invalidated at one item. And to be fair, not having Divine Sunder allows it to be much more likely to be the case. Also, if Sunfire Aegis is a pretty good, like, one item I fight you spike, you know, Sunfire, Heartsteel, Iceborne, Gauntlet, like, slightly offensive skewed tank items that say, actually, I can 1v1 a bit, I can fight for prio a bit. I'm maybe not super favored, but I can look okay against Jax. Maybe I'm actually winning against Riven because I bought an armor item and Riven just, like, doesn't first item Black Cleaver. Probably, I don't think she does. I'm pretty sure she doesn't. It's like, okay, well, cool. Like, this is a back and forth a bit more. There's more going on here. And so the only downside of that is, okay, well, how much damage do you have to give tanks in order for tanks to feel like they can fight a Trinity Force Jax? Or I don't remember, again, what Fiora's first item is, but Fiora, I think, wins every tank anyway. So that one's an ignore. But, like, Camille's maybe a bit more playable on Triforce or Sundered compared to Divine Sunderer. Anyway, all this to say that, okay, we can probably give tanks enough damage via their, you know, first, second max and their kit, but then that also means that we have tanks who are doing almost fighter levels of damage for the first 20 minutes of the game. Like, not quite, but like Sunfire Cape is also a damage item, and Iceborne Gauntlet is also a damage item. It's not as much as Triforce, but you have your base damages that are enough to fight fighters, and you have an item that gives some more damage that helps you fight fighters, and if this goes too far, Orin just solo kills Jhin from full health without using his ultimate. That's also not okay, right? And so, you know, every extreme can go too far, which means that this is actually a fairly delicate balancing act of tank's ability to 1v1 a fighter, in that the matchup has to be volatile, right? Like, the matchup has to be fair in terms of you can actually kind of each kill each other potentially. The fighter is probably favored because the tank is probably a better team fighter, and that's fine. But it also means that they can't win the lane through stalling out. They have to actually win the lane through fighting back. And this means that, again, Sunfire needs to be good, and Hearthstone needs to be good, and Iceborne needs to be good, and all that stuff. And that's, you know, reasonable. And we are, again, buffing these items. But if it goes too high, they just one-shot the, you know, Syndra or something, or they one-shot, more likely they one-shot the Jhin, who's down 3 levels and doesn't have the health that Syndra has. And then you go back to 80 carries hate life, because what it's supposed to do, they're getting dueled by the tank, you know, they're meant to be able to beat, right? So delicate balancing act is kind of tough here, but ultimately we think that, you know, Frozen Heart can go down, Sunfire and Heartsteel can go up, and that these are correct for these champions as a class right now, and we'll revisit as time goes on, but, like, again, where's the damage, where's it coming from, how much is there available? Yeah, it's actually kind of tough. Okay. Next systems change is to 3 sets of AP assassin items. We are buffing Rocket Belt, we are buffing Storm Surge, and we are nerfing Lichbane. So let's talk about Storm Surge. Players have fairly correctly identified that the burst damage of Storm Surge feels pretty low for an item that is pretty explicitly about the burst damage. That is not incorrect. However, the mandate that we are sticking to is that Storm Surge is the ceiling of what we are allowing a single item burst to deal. That we're basically not allowing short interaction received damage to go any higher than Storm Surge is currently. Storm Surge having a melee skew is, I think, correct here, because in the case of a melee champion triggering Storm Surge on you, they had to commit their body to do so. In the case of a ranged champion triggering Storm Surge on you, that's LeBlanc Wing forward and pressing QRE and then Wing backwards. That is not commitment. That is a whole bunch of chunk damage all at once. Storm Surge does, at all points in time, clearly deal more damage than Luden's Tempest, or Luden's Companion, I should say. AP ratio is better, base damage is better. At least in the melee case. I actually double checking on the range case. It's not as good. It's close. AP ratio is, I think, slightly better. Regardless, at least the melee case is better. But, you know, flat pen multiplies it, whatnot. Regardless, this is kind of the ceiling. Lichbane, acknowledged, is grandfathered in. That's not great, and we are actually tapping down some of Lichbane's burst damage here. But at the end of the day, Lichbane is still a burst damage item, a assassin item that AP assassins are happy to use, and it is a little bit overpowered. But anyway, circling back to the point, Storm Surge is roughly at the ceiling of what we are allowing ourselves for burst damage from systems going forward. If we wanted to really retune things, we can go in and look at press the attack and electrocute and all these other things and move them around and give a little bit of that power budget to Storm Surge that it can be the highest proc damage item. Maybe it goes up like 10% or something from where it is now, but ultimately, again, the idea here is League is a worse game when most of your damage comes from instantly applied proc damage. So I want to compare something Storm Surge to, let's say, Profane Hydra. Profane Hydra is a strong item, and in fact, the theoretical proc damage of Profane Hydra is higher than that of Storm Surge. The one saving grace here for Profane is one, it again requires you to commit your body into melee range, and it requires a bespoke, unique cast animation. It's not a fast cast, like a slow cast animation by any means, but Storm Surge happens on its own without your interaction. Lichbane happens on its own without your interaction. Ludens happens on its own without your interaction. All the energized items functionally happen if you're ranged, at least, on their own without any special interaction, just doing the normal things. Automatically applies this all at once, all up front. Combat does this, Aerie does this, Scorch does this, Cheap Shot does this, Electrocute does this, and all of these things stack. Not the keystones, obviously, but like all these things stack alongside Storm Surge. And it's like, oh, that's a lot of proc damage all at once. At least in the case of the team-out upgrades, they do not happen all at the same time. They require their own button press, and so that, by nature of having its own cast time, its own button press, and its own timing, by necessity, by definition, gives some more room for counterplay. I'm not suggesting that all these items are perfectly tuned, but I'm saying that there is a difference between item A does X damage and item B does Y damage if those items literally behave differently. Okay, all this to say that we are not going to be increasing the damage of Storm Surge unless we heavily retune all other proc damage in the game to buy the power budget for Storm Surge damage. This is not moving. This is what's going on. We will retune the item around this. In this patch, this item is getting more move speed on the item itself. We can give it more stats. We can give it, we could choose to say that actually Storm Surge is the big snowball item, and it can give like way more gold per takedown if we wanted to, and say if you're really that good at overkilling, that you have this much damage, you don't even need the Storm Surge, it can be a gold snowball item. Now, obviously it conflicts a little bit with Maji's as also a snowball item, but I think there's potentially room there. Maybe it's meme, I'm not sure, but maybe it's that the proc should always be AoE or something, and this is a way to keep the one-shot individual champion burst case down while making it a little bit better in a team fight or something, in a way that Lichbane can't do that, because Lichbane is forced to be single target. Like, maybe, I'm not sure, these are random ideas, I'm yapping. Either way, Storm Surge is a bit weak. It is currently heavily overpurchased. That is part of what brings the win rate down. Like, Storm Surge is, I believe, last I checked, and to be fair, I think it was actually last patch, Storm Surge was still the most built AP item in the game. And, I mean, players are just wrong to do this. Like, this item is very explicitly a burst assassin item, and it is not correct to do so. Now, if you sort by MMR, highly skilled players buy Storm Surge much, much less. Low skilled players are slow to realize what their correct builds are and are griefing. So for example, part of Jungle Diana's low win rate is a heavy over adoption of Storm Surge when Lichbane and Rocket Belt are far better items on her, and her win rate would be substantially higher if people just built correctly. And this is one thing where observed win rate is not champion power because people are turbo griefing. Storm Surge, currently, to be fair, is actually weak, but there are just some champions where they just simply have better replacements. One of these better replacements is Lichbane. So Lichbane is overperformant, and I think long-term, realistically, Lichbane should actually have a fairly high base AD ratio and a much lower AP ratio to shape it a little bit more like Storm Surge, to where Lichbane is clearly a very good first item, is somewhat pattern-defining, gives you a good amount of stats, feels very good to buy, but then doesn't carry its weight extremely strongly into the late game, giving you a 50% AP ratio for the entire game. That is a lot of extra scaling, that is a lot of extra damage off Magi stacks or Death Cap or whatever. Lichbane is grandfathered in. Old Lichbane had a 100% AP ratio way back in the day. I think that damage was physical way back when, and so that had its own sort of problems here, but or its own difficulties to scale it appropriately. But regardless, Lichbane is currently grandfathered in as the actual highest proc damage item in the game, basically. Magic damage innately deals more damage than physical damage because people's MR is lower than that of their armor, and then additionally, the AP ratio is half as good as the AD ratio, which is functionally the same ratio per point of gold, or really close to it. So Lichbane is actually just better Profane Hydra, and it applies instantly, and the cooldown's shorter. And by the way, Lichbane is really strong. That's why the item is literally just stronger than Profane Hydra for the like suite of assassins. It's literally just better. Aside from the wave clear case, okay, fine, but I'm yapping. Regardless, there is an AP ratio tapped to Lichbane. Again, I think long-term this item should go further, but we have to also be very cognizant of Lichbane does literally nothing else aside from proc damage, and so at least in the case of Storm Surge, it can deal some AoE. It gives you move speed. That is like literally a thing that is different about Storm Surge, is it deals damage and gives move speed on activation. And we could choose to play up Storm Surge as the move speed proc item. And the lightning bolt that flies from the sky is good. It is a solid amount of damage. Like, the amount of damage out of Storm Surge is meaningful. It might just mean that this item needs better stats or more move speed or a shorter cooldown or something, but it's not burst damage. Lich Bane literally only gives burst damage. This current burst damage is higher than Storm Surge at most points in time, but it's also overtuned. If you are a high elo AP assassin player, you know Lich Bane is by far your best option. The win rate's not close. The pick rate delta is not close. It's just clearly what's correct to buy here. And that leads us to Rocket Belt, which is on some champions. There's basically two suite of Rocket Belt users, okay? There are some champions that are just Rocket Belt users. This is Kennen, this is Nico, this is some Fiddlesticks, this is sometimes Rumble, and it's like, yeah, part of my kit is, can I get in range of you? And so I'm just gonna build Rocket Belt. This is just my item. That is not a problem. That is an acknowledgement of what this item does. We are buffing Rocket Belt. We're giving it 10 ability power for 100 gold. We're basically giving you half-priced 10 AP. That is a buff. There is no way half-priced AP is not a buff to every AP item in the game. So strict power positive, Rocket Belt is a better item. It is still one of the cheapest, if not the cheapest AP item. It's not a support item, such as like Shurelya's or Ardent Sensor, but is very clearly inexpensive. That's really fine. It has some health on it, which, to be fair, if you look at, like, what does Kennen do? What does Fiddlesticks do? What does Nico do? They stand in the middle of an enemy team to do their job. That stat profile is very, very reasonable. Totally fine, totally respectable. I think Rocket Belt is a good item, but we took... So compared to Rocket Belt from 4 years ago, old Rocket Belt, I believe, used to multi-hit minions, and the active damage was much, much higher. Now, what I said earlier about us having a hard ceiling on proc damage, we are not going to increase the burst damage of Rocket Belt. It is meant to be lower than Storm Surge, and this is the ceiling at which we will tune items around. So Rocket Belt is weaker than the old version because it does not do well against minions anymore. It locks you out. You can only deal damage with one bolt per minion. It's the same as Ash Volley. The arrow or the bolt will get eaten, and it will deal 0 damage. So it literally deals less proc damage than before with roughly the same stat efficiency. Otherwise, so obviously Rocket Belt is just weaker than the old version, but the item is not critically weak. Again, it is more than reasonable on the Rocket Belt champions. But then the second suite of champions is I'm going to call out 4 AP assassins who would consider either one. This is Nidalee, Echo, Elise, and I'm blanking the last one. I think it's Diana. I think this is the 4. Akali. It's Akali. The 4th one is Akali. These are 4 champions right now who, to some degree, trade off between Lich Bane and Rocket Belt. Right now, if you're Nidalee, Lich Bane and Rocket Belt have almost the exact same win rate for the top 10% of players. We know that active items are innately high elo skewed, so it is reasonable to throw out 80 to 90% of games of players who are not skilled enough to use active items correctly. And we're explicitly balancing active items around high elo play because they use their items appropriately. That to me is reasonable. And if you're a silver Nidalee and you're not good enough at using Rocket Belt, you can just buy Lich Bane and you're going to be fine. There is a replacement for Rocket Belt that is similar win rate that you can just buy, and if you're really optimal, you should have gone Rocket Belt, but if you're not good enough, that's okay. If it's too much mind share, you just have Lich Bane, that's totally reasonable. I think it's a very good design for the item space to say that, well, item A is optimal, and if you're good, you use optimal, but if you're not, item B is close behind, and that's okay. And so that is right now, Lich Bane and Rocket Belt, right now for a large percentage of players for Nidalee. If you look at, I'm going to try to remember it again off the top of my head, Elise, Echo, Akali? Those 3? Yeah, okay. Those are the ones that I basically spot checked. Generally speaking, as MMR goes up, your Rocket Belt adoption goes down. You are more likely to go Lich Bane. And in that same cohort, your Lich Bane win rate remains higher than your Rocket Belt win rate, which means it suggests to me that outside of exactly Nidalee as the one champion where you actually can go either way, the other ones who would reasonably side grade 1 for 1, not only does win rate indicate for reasonably skilled players, Emerald Plus, that Lich Bane outperforms, but for the really skilled players, Masters Plus, they would just rather buy Rocket Belt. In some cases, I think the case is Akali. I think it was Akali. In low elo, Rocket Belt is more common than Lich Bane. In the high elo, Lich Bane is more common than Rocket Belt. They're like, these players are literally better at using actives, and they're like, nah, this ain't me, dude. I'm going Lich Bane. So everything that I can see indicates that for the champions where it would be a side grade of, choose option A or choose choose option B. Rocket Belt is not good enough. Lich Bane is too good. And so Lich Bane, minus 5% AP ratio. Rocket Belt getting half price to 10 ability power. Storm Scourge is getting 3% move speed. This item is actually just weak. Honestly, long-term, Storm Scourge probably needs some work. So one problem here is also, this is a bit of a cursed design problem. We built an item that very overtly sells its lightning bolt effect, and we are suddenly ceilinged on how strong this effect can be, which really, really constrains the design space of the item. Does this mean that there were some missteps in our overall team-wide planning on this item? Yes. This means there was a mistake made months ago that has caused this problem now, and that is unfortunate. This is like, I think, like the one thing out of the system that is like hard to retune. Everything else in the system has been relatively easy to retune, and at the end of the day, this is still like an item that is fun to use, that players are excited to buy. It's just weak, and I'm still pretty sure we can find the tuning where this item is going to work. Let's move on to the next set of topics. So those are the systems updates, right? We're moving some tank items around, we're moving some AP assassin items around, and we're moving some support items around. Let's move on to champion changes now, and there are quite a few. So we start with Bel'Veth. Bel'Veth has been a strong performer for a while. We expected this coming in with the Kraken Slayer changes from 14.3, but essentially a lot of non-bot lane Kraken Slayer users are very, very, very happy on Kraken Slayer. This is, as far as I'm concerned, working as intended. Kraken Slayer is the default skirmisher auto-attacker item. Until we make more good skirmisher auto-attacker items, it's going to be the default. So Kraken Slayer is good on these champions. Bel'Veth buys Kraken Slayer. Bel'Veth is very, very performant on Kraken Slayer. I'm a very big proponent of listening to what players actually do in Champ Select, voting with their time and voting with their actions in terms of what people want to play and what people do not want to play against. Ban rate is a very noisy measurement. There are champions like Shaco and Zed and Blitzcrank and Morgana whose ban rates will be very high no matter their power level. We have to keep that in mind and be aware and do a pretty rigorous job of understanding that some champs will just have a high ban rate regardless of their power level. But as long as we do a good job of being rigorous there, we can identify that Bel'Veth currently in high elo has an extremely high ban rate relative to how popular and powerful she is. Now, don't get me wrong, Bel'Veth is currently very powerful. She's more powerful than she needs to be, and she has a very outsized ban rate, indicating that a large portion of that is likely driven simply by power, and so we're simply giving Bel'Veth less power. There is a bug fix to her passive. She is currently getting 3 stacks of her passive per Void Epic Monster. Specifically, each of the 6 Void Grubs give 1 more stack than they're supposed to, and Rift Herald gives 1 more stack than it's supposed to. So Bel'Veth is getting between 0 and 7 extra stacks of her passive. This is a very small amount of power, but Bel'Veth really, 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 really wants the second Void Grub spawn. And so if she's going to all out for this, that's automatically 3 extra stacks that she's no longer getting in a bug fix. It's a very small thing, but it is a thing that is somewhat power impacting. The bigger one is a reduction to the amount of DR on her E. This is getting nerfed more in later ranks and early ranks, but it's still a nerf across the board on this ability. The supposition here is E is lightly elite skewed as an ability in terms of timing it correctly, in terms of getting into the correct fights and using it and pairing the right amount of damage and whatnot. So actual total damage throughput of E is actually a little bit elite skewed. So we expect these nerfs to be somewhat elite skewed just by itself. And Bel'Veth is most performant in elite MMRs. We're targeting about 2% win rate off for elite. 1.52% is about what we would like here. And so we'll see if we end up hitting the mark. Next is Brand. So Brand is being nerfed specifically for low elo, mid lane, and support. Brand Jungle is in a pretty reasonable spot where he is about a 50% win rate elite champion, which is fine. Like, if you're Masters Plus, this champion is 50% win rate. Sounds good to me. And this is where like almost all his pick rate is in Masters Plus, because he is like 46% mid and support in that MMR bracket. Like, Brand does not exist in high elo, except as a jungler, where he is literally exactly balanced. He has a 50% win rate. He's been here for several months at this point. I mean, it's been off and on. There's been like a bunch of changes, but like Brand is essentially perfectly balanced. And then if you're not in Masters, jungle is his least performant role. He is a stronger mid laner and a stronger support. And he is so strong in low elo, mid, and support that he is breaking our win rate oracle, where he is 53.8% win rate in sub-emerald. That is generally too high for what we allow a champion to be at any individual like grand MR bracket. And so Brand, we would need a very strong, compelling reason to not nerf him. There is not a compelling reason not to nerf Brand. He is overperformant there. So we are nerfing him. And we're trying to nerf things that are essentially low elo skewed because he's already completely non-viable in lane in Masters. Now that said, I played against a challenger brand one trick. He wasn't on brand, thankfully, in solo queue last week, but there are challenger brands out there. Regardless, they would do better if, they just played Maokai, right? But let's move on. So nerfs because of low MMR performance. These changes will be slightly mid lane skewed. That's okay. We're still intended to hit support. So ultimately, we are nerfing the cooldown and the base damage of R. The cooldown is getting nerfed at all ranks, though it's skewed towards late ranks, and the R damage is going down at ranks 2 and 3. This will have a lighter touch on support for sure, but keep in mind that low elo games supports roam less, so they gain more XP. Also, they go longer. And so any sort of late game support nerf disproportionately affects low elo support more than high elo support. So these are generally pretty well targeted things. In general, also R is very easy to use. So in terms of an output, it is a larger portion of the power budget of low elo. That is also true. We can measure the output of the spell by MMR bracket. R is disproportionately a larger portion of his power budget in lower MMRs. All these things are true. All these things are factual. So all pretty reasonable to say, yep, these are what's going on here. Our goals are about 1% win rate off. If he's 52.8 in low MMR, mid, and support, that's fine, and we'll leave him there. That said, because he is a exactly 50% win rate elite jungler, we are compensating roughly that 1% win rate in jungle clear. In passive damage mod to monsters, we've used his lever a lot. We're going to keep using it because it is a very, very easy lever that only affects jungle, and we are okay with his jungle clear being, slower or faster by 2 to 4 seconds in any given patch based on how much jungle power he needs. It's a very, very easy thing to keep his, to have him exist as a champion in elite play. Great. We have some nerfs to Evelynn. This is both version 1 and version 4 of the Evelynn changes. So there are a couple of other things that I considered internally that I shopped around. One of these versions went on PBE. Ultimately, Evelynn has disproportionately very, very huge AP ratios. They're actually very, very, very high, so much so that her most common 3-item build is both Magi's and Death Cap, because she is that ability power skewed. That's not necessarily a problem that she's really AP skewed. But the fact that Magi's literally core build means she is too snowbally, and I don't think that should be the case for any champion. I'm fine with Magi's being a viable option if you are winning and you want to snowball the game. That is fine. In fact, I'm happy to raise the AP ratios of mages who have bad AP ratios so that they can consider Magi's if they are snowballing. I think that's more than reasonable to give that to a set of players. Say, hey, go ahead and snowball. Your items aren't as multiplicative, but if you're really 1v9ing, go buy Magi's and you get a higher top end than you would otherwise have. Go for it. The fact that Magi's is core item on Evelynn means that something is wrong. That is my opinion here, and so I, in basically all cases, always tried to find an AP ratio nerf. What I chose here was going after the Q. Q is more than half of her total power budget, not counting item proc damage like Lichbane, which every champion can apply, so it's usually not part of the calculation when I'm talking about, kit comparisons here. So it's more than half of her total kit output, and Q as a portion of her damage output is elite skewed. So as a champion that is overperforming in elite, this is the target we're going for. We expect to get a little bit more than 1% win rate from the Q changes. We are also nerfing Lichbane a small amount, so we expect to get a little bit more from that as well. Evelynn has, I think, at least 2% of win rate room to lose in elite. That said, if you go sub Emerald, she'll get sub 50 win rate if that happens. In general, that's okay, right? If Evelynn is like, 49, 50, 51, that is a pretty reasonable win rate, curve for Evelynn to be at. Again, champions should be viable somewhere, at least for some section of the player base. That player base may not always be in ranked games, but Evelynn will be more than viable in jungle if we in elite jungle, even just relatively high MR like Emerald Plus jungle, and that should be pretty reasonable here. We know this is a pretty sensitive lever. This can affect her jungle clear. That said, her first clear only has 18 ability power on it, double stat shard. That's not extreme. This is like a 2% damage cut to rank 1 Q. It's not a very big deal. But this will affect her clear a little bit. She'll probably lose a breakpoint somewhere in one of her camps to where it's going to take either an extra Q cast somewhere or an extra auto attack or two. And so her clear probably will get a little bit slower, but this should be reasonable, and if we get something really, really wrong, we can find ways to, bring back her damage if it's like level 1 attack speed or something to make sure her clear doesn't feel like ass. That's totally fine to do. Jarvan was very bound to Old Spear of Shojin. That was very, very strong on him exactly because none of his spells were tagged as hard CC, I think. And so they all got full power from Shojin, and it was just obviously too good. Shojin became a more normal item, and Jarvan is now in a pretty weak state. Jarvan is quite low MMR skewed. He's also relatively easy to play. Jarvan is probably meant to have a pretty good low MMR win rate, though he's not meant to be like 52 in Elite by any means. So we are reverting the Q cooldown nerf from 13, I think it was 23. This change was exactly 1.3% win rate in all ranks of play. And we wanted to get for 2%, and so we gave him about 0.7% of armor growth. Now, this is going to be pretty low elo skewed. This one is going to be relatively flat across MMRs. This means that Jarvan will remain a pretty low elo skewed jungler. That's not necessarily a problem. It's just a state of fact that that's going to be true. Is what it is. I think reasonable overall. Jarvan's going to be pretty good in low MMR. Red Kayn kind of sucks right now, and it appears that a large portion of Red Kayn builds are building Assassin. We would like if Red Kayn was happy to build fighter items. So it's what's basically happening here is a semi-revert of a passive nerf from a while ago, which was nerfing the level scaling on the healing on the Red Kayn passive. Basically, a percentage of physical damage dealt to champions post-mitigation from his abilities, not his auto attacks, if I get this right, is then recouped as health. That used to level scale. He was incredibly low MMR skewed as Red Kayn. Level scaling tends to be a low MMR skewed mechanic, and at the time Red Kayn was doing too well, and so I basically flattened the number to be the level 9 value at all points in time. That did a lot for his MMR skew, which is generally a positive thing, I thought. But at this point in time, Red Kayn now kind of sucks because he really liked Gore Drinker, and the item is gone. And he was really good at applying Gore Drinker because he was really good at putting himself in the middle of an enemy team, popping Gore Drinker, then ulting, winning it out, coming back out, and then oftentimes popping a second Gore Drinker. And it was very easy for him to specifically reposition in 2 spots to use the item. So he was one of the most Gore Drinker bound champions in the game. Jarvan, a little bit like this as well, with Stridebreaker and Gore Drinker, but not nearly as not as severely here. Anyway, anytime you tend to see fighters build Assassin, it will tend to mean one of 2 things, sometimes both. One, they can no longer do their job with fighter items, so they might as well try to one-shot you because they can't play the fighter pattern anyway. This is functionally current tuning Red Kayn without Gore Drinker. He doesn't heal for enough, he's not durable enough, he kinda can't get through it. At the very least, players believe that to be the case, so they'll build Assassin instead because at least that feels chunky and they feel like they can get something done. Even with that build, Red Kayn's not very good. The other could be, and this is a similar point, but it's a different one, is that the shape of the kit does not reward you for fighter outputs. So a case here, for example, would be Yorick E. Most of Yorick's ghoul damage comes from his ghouls, whose durability is functionally health irrelevant because they always get one shot by autos and are functionally immune to spells. But Yorick's ghouls deal all their damage when you land a ranged skill shot, and then deal pure physical damage that has a very high base damage, a moderate AD ratio. Those things scream lethality, by the way, none of which requires being in melee range. Lo and behold, why the hell does York want to buy health? And so in a somewhat similar case here for Kayn, hey, let's make sure he has the kind of things that say, no, you really want to be in melee range for stuff. This could be making sure his Q is a lot of his power budget compared to, say, his W or something. And this could be, in this case here, making sure that the healing on his passive rewards building fighter items. So right now, one other thing that's the case with Kayn and also Aatrox here, not that I'm trying to change these, but it's just a case that is true, is because their healing is post-mitigation, any way that you can reduce your opponent's armor makes you literally heal for more health. And so a Serrated Dirk gives you more healing than a pickaxe, just straight up. And so the nudge here in the Kayn case is to bring back this passive healing, but instead of scaling with level, it's going to scale with bonus HP. And so Kayn's most common 4-item fighter build includes Shojin, I think it's Cleaver and Sundered Sky, not in that order. Death's Dance doesn't have health on it, but that's the other core item that he buys a lot of the time. And I basically pegged that build, which would be a normal level 18 Kayn, at a pretty similar amount of overall healing, which puts you from 25 to 32% healing on the passive, with normal runes on Red Kayn with a normal 4-item fighter build, which would be a late game level 18 situation. If we have to go harder here, we absolutely can, but this will definitely do a lot to indicate that he should build in this way. And overall, I am a fan of ensuring that fighters who are meant to be building durability options scale their durability with durability options in the way that they scale their damage with damage options, that these things are actually in proper tension, and then it can matter. So that's a push here. And then mostly for Winter Magnitude, because I chose to mostly hit equilibrium on this passive change. It's better in a 4 and 5 item case, but it's otherwise going to be very similar to the old Red Cane passive. I chose to start here, and then we can go further if we want to, was a bit more win rate budget by going into the R and amping the amount of healing that R gives. R heals you as a percentage of the tooltip damage once you pop out of the target. And so I'm simply raising this to say that, well, the amount of flat healing your R gives is higher. And so if you have a higher health pool or more resist to multiply that pool against, the more likely you're not going to overcap your healing, and the more likely you are to make use of that. You have more time, right? If you know the payoff's bigger, you can wait longer before going in with the ulti. You can burn down your health bar a bit bigger, and then, pop out and get a lot more out of it, and then, keep going. So both things should incentivize playing a tankier build on Red Cane. Kog'Maw has a lot of lines, all of which are very, very small, but Kog'Maw kind of sucks. We chose to wait a little bit because we buffed Rageblade 2 patches ago, we buffed Terminus last patch, and we waited and we saw that Kog'Maw still kind of sucks. And so it's a bunch of small hits because there aren't great, really strong tuning levers. We didn't want to just give him W damage. So a bit more move speed on the passive, so you can get your trade kills more often. Cast time on Q will now scale with his attack speed, so it will not break him out of his attack flow as often. The flat slow on E is going up, and the bonus AD ratio on the R is going up, so that if he doesn't have the space to auto attack, he can at least have a fallback pattern of playing a little bit of artillery and use a bit more of the kit overall. Maokai is too strong. Maokai right now is a 53.8% win rate champion. That is too strong. That is breaking Oracle. Maokai needs to be nerfed. Basically in point 3, we just simply didn't hit magnitude on support nerf. Obviously, he was still too good there, but part of those changes were meant to trade power back to top and jungle. That the prioritization was trying to bring all the roles closer together in power level while still nerfing support some. And that did happen, but the support nerf we got was simply too small. And he went from being like 55.5 to being like 54.5. Obviously, again, still as strong as a champion. In 14.4, we went to go nerf Maokai more meaningfully, and they meant to nerf him by about 2% win rate. I actually think we did nerf Maokai by about that much win rate. The problem was we buffed Solstice Slay. Solstice Slay was buffed because of its max health ratio on tanks like Maokai, who runs double. So the interesting is the most common build for Maokai is actually double scaling health stat shard. And more than any other tank, Maokai disproportionately uses Slay more than Celestial Opposition. So Maokai was the most buffed tank by the Solstice Slay buff. And he also runs a lot of health as a champion. So this ended up almost fully compensating for the power loss of nerfing Maokai support. If we hadn't missed on Solstice Slay, Maokai would be like 52 and change in support, which is where he was for all of last year. Now, it might be the case that players are no longer okay with a 52-point-X win rate Maokai. We will see if this is the case after this patch, but I wanted to give like a lot of like really clear indication of why this happened. I think we actually did take 2% win rate off of Maokai's kit. He just got it back in his items. Anyway, we are acknowledging those mistakes and we're trying again. And I actually want to be clear on something. I actually brought up, like, do we want to push Maokai all the way down to 50% this patch because we think players are going to rebel against anything else? The call from my boss, Rek'Sai, was like, no, we should put him at the win rate we think is appropriate for Maokai and stop there. And so the win rate I think is appropriate for Maokai is between 51.5 and 52. And the reason is he's been there for literally years of support and no one cared. If people still care, we will go further down, but we've seen champions like Rakan chill at 51.5 and no one cares. And Rakan as a, like, not like full Vanguard, like he's not doing Nautilus and Leona things to you, people tend to be pretty okay with fairly aggressive tanks who are not completely in your face. Maokai does not have the engage range of Leona or Nautilus or whatever. And again, long-term player behavior data, bans, pick rate, what have you, indicate that Maokai is a very successful champion at 51.5 to 52.5. And so we are trying to put Maokai at around, I think it's gonna be like 51.7 if everything lands correctly. We might not get that, but that is what we are aiming for going on here. So the first things first is we're going to take about 1.3% of win rate off of Maokai based on changes to Solstice, Slight, and Celestial Opposition. So I actually did the math. I looked up the percentage of which support items Maokai builds. And as I said, Maokai disproportionately uses Solstice Slay. And we are expected to nerf Solstice by 2% win rate and buff Celestial by 1% win rate. Accounting for the relative pick rates of these items, the total changes to support items will innately nerf Maokai's win rate by 1.3%. So if we didn't touch Maokai in this patch, if we got all our numbers right, Maokai would be 52.5, which is where he was in 1324 when no one cared. That said, 50.5 is probably still too high for Maokai. So we're adding another roughly 1.3% of win rate nerf on base MS, which we think is going to be about 0.75% win rate, and W cooldown going lengthened by 1 second. These will sum up to about 1.3 here. There's some debate over whether base move speed is a larger or lesser lever for Maokai. Unlike a champion like, say, Nidalee, right? Nidalee can compensate this by having literal dashes on the kit where she can, ignore her move speed. Maokai certainly gets some bonus MS when his ult lands and whatnot, but this will multiply against Solstice Slay, so you can debate either way. Obviously, if you buy Swifties, that is additive with base MS, so he cares about 5 a little bit less. If you buy Trailblazer, the 5% MS on the Winged Moon plate and the finished Trailblazer, that's multiplicative of base MS, but also the flat 20 on the item is additive, so you can go either way. But Maokai is, I think, more than most tanks, probably Alistar is more tied to this, but Maokai is really, really, really tied to his actual move speed because his entire kit is kind of based around literally closing the gap on you in the way that, like, Blitzcrank can have almost any base move speed, and W plus Q will be in range to, execute as well to a certain degree. So we'll see, but ultimately, between base MS and W cooldown, we think about 1.3-ish% win rate here. 1.3% win rate is what the math says for overall support tank item changes, which means Maokai should be at about 51 and change if he's losing about 2.6% win rate on the patch. We'll see how people feel about that, but that is what's going to happen in Maokai support if we get all the numbers right. The final change is there is some compensation to early game jungle clear on Maokai. Maokai jungle is his secondary audience, despite its win rate being even worse than in top lane. It is his secondary audience. Keeping him viable in a role other than support is something that we want to do. We are aware that the pro metagame is pretty tank heavy. That is true right now. We can try to do some unwork to unbind that, but there's just been other things that have been more important than moving around the jungle metagame in pro play. So we've been focusing on the other parts of the game right now, but we can make changes here to move that metagame around. I'm down to do that. At some point, we'll start doing MSI balance, and that means we will take that kind of work in earnest. But for now, trying to preserve some Maokai jungle win rate. His first clear specifically is very, very, very slow. This change is skewed towards the early levels. Nidalee, we could have nerfed in the previous patch. Nidalee is a nerf because of her elite levels of win rate and ban rate. She is extremely, extremely elite skewed, though it appears that the changes from 14.3 closed that gap somewhat. It's still a very large gap. We don't expect to close that very much, but not reopening it is an ideal thing here. We are taking back the 5 base moves we gave her a few packs ago because we're very happy with what the new heal is giving her. We're actually very happy that she has a different fallback pattern. We think that helps if you're not a great Nidalee player to have at least something to do so that your silver Nidalees on your team aren't griefing your team entirely picking this champion because she has something to do if she can't snowball the early game. We also think that Cougar Q damage, if your target is hunted, the damage amp coming through the Q is going to be a little bit lower, which should hopefully be a little bit elite skewed there, but essentially trading out a little bit of assassination damage from Nidalee here. We know she's also getting hit by Lichbane changes here, although she has a completely acceptable side grade in Rocket Belt, and so if you just simply switch your build, you'll actually compensate for that pretty decently here. So not sure Nidalee's going to lose too much overall, but regardless, again, required nerf because she's simply too good in high elo, and so that happens here. Senna is an interesting case here, where Senna is, I don't know if she's exactly number 1, but she is in almost every single pro play game, and 3-1 played as support, with a farming tank typically as her co-bot laner. When you look at solo queue, In solo queue, her AD carry win rate is like 3% above support. So not as dire as, Seraphine, where it's 6% across, but yeah, she has an audience in both roles, and we like to, balance them both pretty well. And the nice thing is, a bonus AD ratio on Q should, now certainly it scales based on number of souls gained, but pros are better at gaining souls than solo queue champions and solo queue players. And it scales based on gold earned, which bot lane Seraphine gets. So this very, very lightly, and don't get me wrong, like this will just nerf solo queue support Senna, and solo queue support Senna will be a sub 50 win rate champion. That will be true. But also she's pretty much a must nerf for two other categories of play. One is pro, one is solo queue ADC. I think this lever does disproportionately hit those two more than the other one. But yeah, we might have to find some way to buff solo queue support Senna. I'm not sure what that looks like. But one thing I actually do want to point out, by the way, is for the average solo queue Senna player, stop buying Umbroglaive. For the vast majority of you, the enemy supports already suck at warding, and your teammates suck at using ward control, and your opponents suck at using ward control. Just buy a Youmuu's Ghostblade. Like, if you're worried about Senna support's win rate being bad, buy Youmuu's instead. You'll gain the win rate right back. This is a case where I think her solo queue win rate is deflated in support because the builds are wrong. If you're not a pro player, you're not, or like Masters or, GM or something, or like playing Clash with high diamond players or something like that, like, you don't actually need the ward controls much. Like, this item is kind of balanced around pro play, which is maybe not ideal. Like, maybe Umbral is cursed. I'm not sure. But realistically, just buy Youmuu's. For your solo queue game, just buy it instead. It's going to be better. Sivir's getting 4 armor. This puts Sivir at one of the highest, actually, I think it's literally the highest base armor for a marksman in the game. I think the only champion who might deserve more is Nidalee. I actually don't know if Nidalee is higher. I didn't check, to be clear. But she has like the dodge, and she has, I think, actually natively kind of high regen. And she also has native lifesteal on her, Q once you get a cloak of agility. Regardless, Sivir is not a lane bully, but she is very, very short range and doesn't have the same kind of evasive tools that a Vayne or a Kai'Sa has, where I think they not only have some pretty okay... I mean, like, all the champions have some kind of way of clear. Vayne obviously doesn't, but, like, they have ways of, like, punishing a weak cooldown by like getting forward really quickly, right? With tumble, or I forget what Kai'Sa E is called, literally, turbocharge, something like that, whatever, supercharge, I think. But also just, yeah, Sivir doesn't have a way of like outplaying you. She can spell shield like a Caitlyn Q once in a while. It's still a bad matchup, by the way. She just has to like kind of take autos, and so this will give Sivir a lot of safety to safely farm. This gives her the safety to be much less punished and scale into late game, and this is going to be quite a bit of power. Sivir is one of the flattest mastery curve AD carries in the game. She's actually probably balanced if she's not stuck in pro jail at like 51.5 to maybe even 52% win rate in bot lane. Kind of like Misfortune is, where Misfortune is a very easy to play champion. It actually has a pretty straightforward counterplay. Also, the simple fact that Sivir is somewhat supportive is generally going to be a pretty valuable thing in solo queue, where oftentimes team comps are pretty low in utility. Like, if the most common supports in the game are like Zyra, Brand, and Lux, where's your team app coming from? It's like, maybe it's going to come from the Sivir. So I think Sivir probably does deserve a good resting win rate. I will say part of her win rate is deflated by people building incorrectly. People should be building Shiv, not Kraken Slayer. Kraken Slayer does not scale ricochet damage. Static Shiv does, because it's 300 gold cheaper and you can get your next item faster. So you can go finish your Infinity Edge, your Quick Blades, 300 gold sooner. That matters. So Sivir's win rate is deflated by people building incorrectly. Go build Shiv. That item is cracked now. Enjoy your 4 armor, and Sivir will be one of the better AD carries next patch. Smolder is getting a whole bunch of reshapes, so I want to talk about some stuff. We'll talk about the builds a little bit later, but let's talk about what's going on with Smolder. So there's 2 points here. So one is the standard champion designer follow-up on the champion. Now that this champ has gone live, what do they look like? What are they doing? How are they performing? Where is the various points of power budget in the kit? Do we like that now that players have had a chance to break down builds and identify what's going on here? So there's several things going on. One of them is embracing builds as players find them. Spear of Shojin is a very, very sensible and sensible item on Smolder. It is the most basic ability haste you can get in a single slot. It is clearly amazing. It is clearly a pretty near correct item on him. I don't think that was the initial recommended build. And initially when Smolder first came out, he had a lot of crit ratios in a lot of places because we assumed he would have to go Essence Reaver, Quick Blades, LDR, Bloodthirster, like the normal AD carry crit stuff with one source of ability haste and Essence Reaver. I guess, sorry, with two because then you have Quick Blades as well. So, okay, good amount of ability haste, but then it stops at 2 items, right? Like 2, and then you probably have the cooldown boots and whatever. Shojin obviously is very, very good. Triforce is a good alternative to Essence Reaver as well. And so it turns out that there's actually some other builds out there that, we want to look at and entertain and say, okay, well, do these builds make sense? Do they fit the champion fantasy pretty well? Are we okay with these outputs? Are these all reasonable? And it's like, actually, we are pretty happy with the sort of caster ecosystem for Smolder, where he is very likely to buy things like Spear of Shojin. He is somewhat likely, though not super likely, to buy items like Trinity Force, and we're kind of okay with that. And so, yeah, willing to embrace ER Shojin as a core build. Okay, well, it turns out you don't need to scale and crit anymore because it is very much on fantasy to buy the high haste Sheen item and the high haste ability, like basic ability damage amp item. Okay, ER Shojin is actually your core build, not ER Quick Blades. You know what? That's a good point. That's your build. Let's embrace that. Let's go. And so one of the reshapes on E is cutting the crit ratio off of E. You're right, Smolder. You don't have to build crit every slot. Buy it when it makes sense for you. Go have fun, buddy. Cool. And so it was like current Master Plus build is Essence Reaver Shojin into RFC is basically his core build. Okay, thumbs up. That build makes sense. That's you, right? So let's not try to goad you into buying sort of incorrectly. You can if you want, but whatever. And so E's damage, I think, number of shots is getting changed from a crit ratio to a number of stacks ratio. Okay, great. Solid reshape there. It's power positive. He's going to have more shots overall for his common builds, but it is what it is. R is getting reshaped. This happened with a W as well in the last patch, where W doubled its bonus AD ratio functionally. R is getting an AD ratio on, I believe it's the heal. And then because the sweet spot is getting amped, the AD ratio on the sweet spot of the R is also going up. That's getting traded out for a base damage decrease and a base heal decrease, that if you're playing tank Smolder or if you're playing AP Smolder, you are losing on a base damage, you're losing on a base heal. But if you're playing AD Smolder, you are getting more sweet spot damage and you're getting relatively equal amounts of, I believe it's relatively equal amounts of healing, maybe a small downgrade, but it's nudging him saying, well, we saw the AP builds. They're not obviously strong, but no, we really think there's a good build here with the Essence Reaver Shojin kind of stuff. So let's really try to reinforce that. No, if you go Jack Show or Iceborne Gauntlet, your damage is going to start to fall off because AD ratios are a more meaningful part of your kit, not so much the bases. And so much like the W changes last patch, it's another nudge to say, no, AD is still going to be a relevant scaler on your champion. For example, Aurelion Sol also does this, where Aurelion Sol does have flat stack scaling on the execute threshold, on the E, on the percent health damage, on the Q. There's a bunch of stuff on the R that does this as well. And yet, his AD ratio or his AP ratios are really, really good to the point where he still wants to buy a Death Cap. He still wants to buy a Crypt Bloom. He still wants to buy AP in every single slot, and he's not buying Jack Show 5th almost ever because the AP ratios are part of the scaling fantasy, not just the stacks. Okay, great. So reshape to the R. Reshape, to be fair, the E is moving off of crit onto stacks, but the R is moving off of bases onto AD ratio, right? Okay, great. Then we have a reshape to the Q. So Q4, this is the 225 point evolve on Q. There is an iteration on this compared to what was on PBE yesterday. Essentially what we're doing with Q is we are backloading this further. Essentially, when you finish evolving Q at 225, it will have less damage than before. And so the so here's what is about Smolder actually. So Smolder's observed win rate right now is definitively low MMR skewed. So even though better players are better at stacking on the champion, low MMR games go longer, so he has more room to stack, and every other stacking champion like Aurelion Sol and Nasus is more aggressively low MMR skewed, because to be fair, Smolder has, I would say, deeper optimizations around stacking than the other two champions here. Veigar also in that case. Again, Smolder's optimizations I think are deeper than Veigar's. And then the other case is that his early game is weak enough, not saying it's really weak, but weak enough that higher skilled players are better at punishing. So ultimately, Smolder has a relatively modest, like 1% to 2%, low MMR skew. He does not win half his games in Masters Plus. He's relatively good. He's got a pretty high ban rate. But what we're trying to do here is essentially say, well, what we wanted to do was embrace the scaling fantasy here. And we really want him to be successful in low MMR. Is my understanding here. I'm not 100% up to date on everything here, but because this is like largely not a project under my pod, other than our tuning guardrails here, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So basically, there is now an AD ratio and a stack ratio on the burn damage on Q4, but the base damage is much, much lower, to where at 225 stacks and 3 items, it is less damage, period, than before. There is an AP ratio. The AP ratio is pretty modest. Honestly, I'm pretty sure AD builds are still better. We'll talk about it a little bit later. But ultimately, part of the scaling of Q is not just stack scaling, but it is gold scaling as well. Of course, gold scaling has a hard cap on how many items you can buy. Stack scaling, of course, can go infinite, but that ratio is modest enough to not go to infinity pretty easily, to where I think the numbers are pretty comfortable. The overall changes here are meant to be neutral to maybe minus 0.5% win rate. It is very likely you will see an observed win rate increase patch over patch because players are still gaining mastery at him, and so his win rate gains by day. And then you drop it down, and you're like, well, he's gained 40 days of mastery and 1 patch of nerfs. Is that higher or lower than the midpoint of last patch? So for example, if you looked at Smolder's patch data for this patch, you would see win rate drop, and then if you check 5 days later, the win rate is actually higher than last patch because mastery happens, right? And so again, trying to keep up with mastery growth and bring power down a little bit here. Okay. Let's actually talk about builds real quick, because one thing I actually saw was heavy strawmanning around Smolder's AP builds. So looking at Masters Plus, Doran's Blade has a higher first item win rate than Doran's Ring. So in highly skilled play, the AD ratios are good enough now that you might as well just start Doran's Blade. If you look at Liandry's as an item purchase in any given slot, it does not outperform his most common and most successful AD options at any point in time. The only thing that is concerning here are tank items. Jack Show and Koenig Rookern are extremely performant items. Now, these are often items you build when already snowballing item 5 or item 6 on a full build, 275 stack Smolder. That is a core concern, and is actually why there's an AD ratio increase on R and an AD ratio existing on Q, so that if you skip Bloodthirster or LDR or whatever for a tank item, you are literally giving up Q damage, and you are literally giving up R damage, and you're literally giving up R healing. To say that I am, that I think it's not terribly hard to shape this champion somewhat like Aurelion Sol, where you never stop to build tank because your gold scaling is enough of the budget, while still being a level scaler that is somewhat low skewed and on fantasy and all that. Smolder was always meant to be more of a caster. Again, the initial theory was that he would have to do this by building ER quick blades and staying in the crit space the entire time. When Smolder was first being built, this was not the version of Spear of Shojin that was in the game. Smolder, right? Champions take a very, very long time to build, and Rework Spear of Shojin, I think, existed as of 5 months ago, maybe a little bit less. I'm not sure exactly, right? But it went live in January, which was the patch before Smolder, I think, right? And most of Smolder's dev, where we, figured out what his hooks were going to be, were earlier. And I don't know, maybe we should have caught that Shojin was going to be sick on him. I couldn't tell you what it was supposed to be exactly. Turns out that Shojin has actually been full power on reshapes the whole time. That probably would have changed the calculus because it was bugged. Turns out that Shojin just is sick because it gives you the full power there. These are all things that matter. But yeah, Smolder, the caster ADC, who has a stacking fantasy, we're moving in that direction. We're making, I think, better shapes in these abilities and trying to bring down a little bit of power because he's a little bit over. Let's move on and talk about Twisted Fate. So the goals last patch were to nerf Twisted Fate by about 1% win rate, both as an AP carry and as an AD carry. We went slightly over magnitude by about 0.3% at APC, looking at Roa Lichbane or other similar 2-item AP builds. He lost a little bit more than 1% win rate on those builds overall in the game, so we went a little bit over mag on AP builds. Doing a similar thing for AD builds, he lost about 0.7% on similar, what are your common 2-item AD builds on TF? This is, I think it's Shiv Stormrazor or Shiv RFC or something. I forget exactly what they were, but I looked at his 2 most common 2-item builds, and they were joined about 0.7% win rate down. So we were actually very, very close to magnitude. We were very, very close. Almost within just simple variance of magnitude goals last time. Now, some of this is because we chose to nerf TF very, very late, and so we didn't have a lot of time for investigation. We had basically 2 hours to get changes in, And so as I looked at win rate data, I looked at his item builds, and said, okay, it looks like we should do about -1% win rate. And we got pretty close to about -1% win rate on both builds. Now, the observed winner of TF did not go down by 1% because people got better at optimizing and got better at doing the builds correctly. But in terms of like, right, like if you even add in players got more mastery at the champion, the observed difference is still 0.7%. You add in the fact that people are starting to build him better because they're building him crit and not on hit, they're building Energizer, and you get more win rate lift because people are building him more correctly. The goals this patch are to actually take a -2% off of AD Twisted Fate. Having taken more time to gather data and gather a larger plan and have an actual acknowledgement of what his win rate should rest at as attacking with Twisted Fate, the goal is to park TF at 49.x in top lane, mid lane, and bot lane. He should not outcompete traditional marksmen in bot lane on average, though him being viable I think is totally reasonable. He should not outcompete top laners on average, and he should not outcompete AP Twisted Fate in mid lane. And so the goals are that AP TF mid is 50, which is roughly where he is right now, and that AD TF in all three roles is 49.x roughly. I don't think it needs to be 47. I think the champion can be roughly balanced. If you have the mastery, you can be above 50 on him, but we'll start there. And if players still reject 49% win rate Twisted Fate, then we will see if he has to be a 48% win rate Twisted Fate, or if it's just never going to be sellable. But I don't believe that's true. But let's see now. The goal explicitly is now 49.x on ADTF. So the nerfs targets are the rank up attack speed on E. This will not affect APTF until level 14, but it will affect him a little bit. The bonus AD ratio on E, very substantially. This will not affect APTF until he borrows RFC as a third item. And even that's not going to be that big of a deal. But if this does end up being too much power off of APTF, who is a champion who's traditionally sat at 49% win rate and been completely reasonable, we will compensate if needed. Happy to compensate APTF later if needed. There's plenty of things that have AP ratios in the kit that we can happily put some power into if he needs it. Not a big problem at all. But we'll see where he lands with these things in place, and we will go from there. Vayne. Our goal is -2% win rate to Vayne. -2% to top lane specifically, minus about 1.75 to bot lane. We are intending to top lane skew the changes a little bit. Her audience is primarily in bot lane. It's about 3-1 there, but she's a really high win rate champion in both places. One thing I saw was some confusion over terminology that Rek'Sai used around staleness. So let me try to give a definition as I understand of how we view staleness. A champion is considered stale if they are stronger than their like normal balance state, like if they are above their like ideal resting win rate, and they've been there for a very long time to the point where it's worth it to act. So for example, let me think of like some good examples here, right? So like Phreak has been 52.5% win rate for a very, very long time, and absolutely no one cares. In fact, some people will tell you that Phreak is the worst champion in League of Legends. Phreak wins more than half his games in every single MMR bracket. We are not nerfing Phreak because no one cares that Phreak wins more than half his games. Players do care that Vayne wins more than half her games. And so a champion who actually garners ban rate and rests at above 50 is a kind of champion who can qualify for a staleness nerf, right? There are champions who are objectively more powerful than Vayne. Nidalee wins more games than Vayne does. But also Nidalee is so unpopular that she arguably doesn't qualify as a staleness nerf. Misfortune, on average, wins more games than Vayne. However, her ban rate is very, very small. And to be fair, part of this is Misfortune's win rate is kind of fake because her mastery curve is so shallow that she's very easy to play. She's not actually necessarily more powerful than Vayne. She just wins more games than Vayne because the average silver player is better at playing MF than they are at playing Vayne. So of course the win rate's higher. Doesn't mean she's actually stronger. It just means she's actually easier. So in some cases, win rate is fake. Vayne's the kind of champion where she wouldn't natively have a 50% win rate because she's easy or something, or she natively counters the metagame or anything like that. But she's never been 53.8, and she's never been a 30% elite ban rate champion, and so she doesn't qualify under any of the automated ban rate metrics. And so it's the kind of thing where it's like, actually, hang on a second, I think we should nerf Vayne. She's been a bit too good for a very long time, and players kind of care. So I actually want to dive into this a little bit because I think it's very interesting. So here's some weirdness. This is comparing Vayne to Twisted Fate, because Vayne and TF are both ranged top laners and bot laners who have more play rate in bot lane than top lane. Now, TF, of course, is also a mid laner. That changes things around a little bit, but I want to talk about this. So what this is This is Vayne's data and then TF's data in top lane. This is all ranks, patch 14.4. This is win rate, pick rate in this role specifically, and banner of the champion overall. Obviously, banner of the champion overall has to include the other roles pick rate, but we'll talk about that. So Vayne wins more games and is played in more games top lane than TF, but TF has twice the ban rate. Asterisk, TF is in a lot more games because TF is also a mid laner bot laner. Okay, in bot lane, Vayne wins the same number. Yes, Vayne's top and bot lane win rates are literally identical according to public data. I did not check internally. Vayne's bot lane win rate is identical to TF's bot lane win rate. Her bot lane pick rate is higher than TF's bot lane pick rate, just like her top lane is the same boat. The ban rate, again, as an aggregate champion, is still lower than that of TF as an aggregate champion. The final thing is that Twisted Fate is a relatively balanced mid laner with a modest pick rate that in all ranks actually lower than the bot lane pick rate. Now, use some quick math here. This ends up being around what, this adds up to 17 plus, or wait, yeah, sorry. This adds up to what, 13 and change plus 2.5. Like this is like what a 16% total play rate TF versus a roughly 14% total play rate Vayne. So Vayne is slightly less popular overall as a champion than Twisted Fate. Like Vayne's in fewer total games than TF, but TF wins fewer games than Vayne in the exact same roles. In the exact same roles, Vayne wins more and is more popular in the roles in which these champs are overtuned. Like TF mid is fine. This is a totally this is not an offensive mid lane win rate, but Vayne is literally more common and more performant. But TF holds on the ban rate. This is the kind of thing that I reference and urge you to consider when we talk about things like staleness, because Twisted Fates, and to be fair, about the Twisted Fate ban rate, is his ban rate is still climbing day by day. So the ban rate today, as opposed to over the patch, is even higher in the case of TF and relatively flat in the case of Vayne. So it's players truly, to a staggeringly different degree, just don't care as much about Vayne as they do about TF. One thing I also looked up because I was curious is in North America specifically, both Vayne and TF have higher ban rates in NA than worldwide. So specifically in a Reddit-esque or Twitter-esque echo chamber, and understand is predominantly North America, is wow, these champs are really, really overboard. These champs have higher pick rates and higher ban rates in NA. I didn't check every server, but I just compared NA to worldwide. Higher pick rates and higher ban rates, and so unsurprisingly, there is a very large Reddit echo chamber or Twitter echo chamber or whatever of why these champs are really, really over, or I assume there's probably a streamer echo chamber as well, whatnot. And it's not that these champions are not overtuned. This is true, but they're actually a bigger problem. You face them more in North America than in other servers, which I just find interesting, bringing it up as an interesting consideration here. Anyway, as mentioned, our goals for Vayne are -2% win rate top lane, so she is a 50% win rate top laner, which will probably crush the entire pick rate. There are plenty of ranged top laners with higher win rates. Teemo, Akshan, and Quinn all just win more games top lane than 50% of the time. And they will eat all the pick rate, and those champs aren't really viable in any of the roles. Okay, Akshan's good mid. And so Teemo has a lot of roles, whatever. Regardless, they will just eat all the Vayne pick rate, and in some cases, this is actually one of their only homes. Akshan's most commonly a top laner. Quinn is especially only a top laner. I think Teemo's primary audience is top lane. They're allowed to be viable at the very least. Regardless, goals -2% in top lane, a little bit less than that in bot lane, because I think 50 and change Vayne bot is reasonable. And so, was trying to go for top lane skewed changes. So what's going on here with Vayne? So we're nerfing the flat move speed on her passive. Her ability to run down an enemy champion is a much bigger thing in top lane than in bot lane. Certainly the reason this was buffed in the first place, and the reason that Tumble was buffed in the first place, is that Vayne in bot doesn't really have gameplay unless Tumble is good. So a couple things here. One, we actually want Vayne to primarily play Tumble max, because Tumble has a lot of gameplay in lane, in the context of bot lane, where you can use it to dodge skill shots, you can use it to trade back up, you can use it to kind of follow up on a support engage, and there's actually stuff going on. You have a button to press, because in a normal bot lane altercation, unless there is hard CC, you are absolutely never triggering silver bolts on an enemy champion, which means Vayne does not have a W and doesn't have an E in the entire laning phase of Vayne. That until you get to team fights, your champion has literally one button, and also kind of not a passive. And that's not good. That still is going to be true because there's only so much juice we can give Silverbolts, but what we at least can do is say, okay, well, we can make Tumble a good enough skill and a frequent enough skill, because you're going to max it first, that you have gameplay pretty frequently that is pretty potent, and so you have gameplay in bot lane. And if we weren't constrained by top lane power level, this could probably rest somewhere different, but whatever. That is why the passive move speed was buffed. That is why Tumble was buffed, and is why we're actually trying to nudge Vayne players to mostly max Tumble first, because then you have gameplay to play around in bot lane. When you're playing around in top lane, you're generally just lots of things normally, and then Tumble autoing and running away. And then Tumble comes off from cooldown, and you Tumble auto and run away. And you can't really space Vayne because she tumbles forward with a bunch of bonus move speed. And by the way, Tumble speed is based on her move speed. It's 500 plus her total move speed. And so the 45 or 30 she gains from Night Hunter adds on to that. And she tumbles actually literally faster going forward. The dash completes sooner. She gets to auto sooner. And so she's just, quite good, as it turns out, in that context. And the gameplay is kind of bad in top lane, but the gameplay is actually quite good in bot lane. And so we're trying to find ways to disproportionately nerf her in top lane because his gameplay is fine in the other role. So the run down to the passive move speed, we think, is top lane skewed, and the early cooldown of Q, the frequency at which she can harass her lane opponent in top lane, is getting weaker. Enforcing Q max is implicit here. That is fine. That is anticipated. It is what it is. Veigar is getting some pretty simple buffs. Q is getting some, I think it's just ratio. I don't think it's base damage. It might be damage ratio, I forget. But either way, Q is getting more powerful. And R is getting a better cooldown at ranks 1 and 2, buffing Veigar's early game, as well as buffing his overall Q gameplay. Q's throughput as a skill is elite skewed a little bit, so this will bridge the gap between low and high MR a little bit, which is kind of nice. And rank 1 and 2 cooldown of R buffs the early game more than the late game, which is also something that tends to be at least good a little bit. I mean, Veigar really sucks in super high elo. He's a typical late game scaler. It'd be very hard to break that away. He just wants to play for 70 minutes in the game, right? So this won't suddenly flatten him out, but I think they're in a correct direction, which is good. Vex is getting some more damage on her passive. I am not a big Vex expert. My understanding from what overheard discussions around her was to play up her strength in her good matchups. Vex's two most common lane opponents are indeed Yasuo and Yone. Across her 6 most common lane opponents, she is statistically favored into 5 of them. That's pretty big. Vex should have a very high win rate because she should have a very high win rate, right? Because if that's the case, she should rest far above 50% win rate. So yes, Vex is getting some more damage on her passive to play up the fact that she is very good in some very good matchups. By the way, most players are not one tricks of a champion. The vast majority of players will typically main a class of champions or a role, but the vast majority of players are not hard one tricks. And so playing up reasons to play Vex, as if you are, a Vex player, meaning that Vex is in your champ pool, you will more frequently see reasons to go bring out the Vex, and you're like, sweet. This is a Vex angle. Awesome. Like, they blinded Yone. I'm in there. This is going to be fun. And so we are intentionally saying that, yes, we're going to further sharpen Vex's ability to get value out of the passive, which is, skewed towards playing against dashing champions. And then letting her get passive refund on E-minion kills, which is going to be pretty small. It's not going to be a very frequent occurrence, but it's still going to be there to do something. We are doing some follow-up on Wukong. We gave him some buffs 2 pats ago. They very strangely were really jungle skewed, which was surprising to us because we thought Q range is going to be really top lane skewed. But ultimately, Wukong is now about a 49 and change win rate champion in both top and jungle. Much like Misfortune from earlier, Wukong is a very easy to play straightforward champion, which means his resting win rate should probably be around 52 in top lane because he's easy to play. In low elo, and probably around 51 in jungle. He's a little bit harder to play in jungle, but still a really straightforward champion. And so if he's balanced for solo queue, 52 top, 51 jungle is probably about right for Wukong. And currently he's 49.x, so 2% win rate or so at the top lane, 1.5% win rate or so at the jungle. Pretty reasonable here, right? So what's cool is we are changing up the passive stacking paradigm. So the way Wukong passive works right now is functionally you can get, I believe it's 5.5x your passive power. You get 1x power on the first stack, and you get 0.5x for the next 9 stacks up to 10 stacks. And so you can get, 1 plus 9 times a half is 1 plus 4.5 is you can get 5.5 times the stack value. But it requires 10 hits to get all the way there. This is spell hits or auto attacks on enemy champions, or I think it's large monsters, maybe it's any monster, I forget. Regardless, it is very, very easy for a jungle Wukong to get at 10 stacks because he's going to sit there punching, the big wolf, the red buff, whatever, the entire time. In top lane, it's much, much harder to auto summon more than 3 times. E auto Q and then walk away is 3 hits. If you can train them down, okay, E auto Q, walk forward, auto a 4th time, hit a 4th time, hit a 5th time. Like, at a certain point, you're just not walking them anymore. It's very, very hard to get 10 full stacks when fighting a champion. So the change here is no longer giving you half value on stacks past the first. It's just 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1. The stack cap is now 5. So technically, the max stack value is down very, very slightly. If you're ever to hit someone 10 times, yeah, sorry, it's only as good as hitting someone 9 times. In the jungle, that's going to happen pretty frequently. But like, if you're starting a red buff and you I assume you start E when you're starting red buff or whatever, because the attack speed is really good. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure it would be the correct thing. You're going to get to those 5 stacks for the armor and health regen a bit sooner. You still need more than 10 auto skill to camp, I'm pretty sure, but like, it'll give you something up front. But especially when you're trading in top lane, you will have the armor sooner to withstand the blows, and you'll just get straight up more regen in pretty much every throughput here to let you recoup damage after every one of these trades. So we think it's going to be very, very aggressively skewed towards top lane where you don't have the same window to hit somebody. The other change is making these stacks fall off one at a time, much like Lily passive works and Jack's passive works, where when a stack times out, you lose 1, and then it times out, and you lose a second, and it times out, you lose another, and it times out, and you lose another. So it'll be much easier to retain a decent number of stacks if you can re-engage. Now, I think it's actually very, very likely that Wukong will use this actually more in the jungle. He's going to much more likely have 2 stacks left as he goes from blue. Like, if you're low elo and you don't kite your camps, like if you're relatively high elo and you just kite your blue up towards Gromp, you're not going to lose stacks. And you kite your Gromp up towards Wolves, you're not going to lose stacks, right? You can just E4 and you're not going to lose any stacks. Like, the time's going to be fine. But if you're lower elo, it would be much more likely that you might go from 10 to 0 and have to build all the way back up. Whereas now it's going to be I go from 5 to 4 to 3. Oh, I'm in range again, and I'm hitting. And so that will be a low elo skew jungle buff. It's going to be just a straight up top lane buff, period, because it's much more difficult for you to keep your stacks at all times. And so a change there. Yorick is getting a set of changes and a set of nerfs. So first off are just some tweaks to how Maiden works, because basically for gameplay clarity and working the way it should. So Maiden is currently the squishiest permanent minion by a lot. And by permanent minion, I mean things like Daisy and Tibbers, where they last for a very, very long time and they're functionally permanent. Obviously, they actually have durations, but they're not meant to die soon in a fight in the way that Malzahar Voidlings will, or Heimer's ulti turret has a very, very fixed duration that is meant to time out. Right? Maiden and Tibbers and Daisy are not really meant to time out in the course of a fight. So those things are quite durable. Maiden is less durable by a meaningful margin than Tibbers and Daisy against most damage, unless it's AoE damage. If the damage is tagged AoE, aka you're playing Aatrox, your damage is cut by half, because Maiden inherits the AoE damage reduction that his ghouls have, which makes them arguably appropriately tanky as ghouls. But Maiden is ranged, and thus isn't subjected to Crowstorm, and isn't subjected to random Annie-W, isn't subjected to Zac Ultimate, isn't subjected to a lot of the random AoE damage that is reasonable for melee minions like ghouls and voidlings, or maybe even theoretically Heimer turrets, though Heimer turrets again are also ranged. So probably not those. They probably wouldn't reserve one. Regardless, that shape seems clearly wrong. If Yorick is going to go 1v1 you, the idea of maybe sometimes I fight Maiden is not meant to be, oh, does my champion have the ability to literally damage this thing? It's meant to be, should I fight Maiden or not? Did he leave it alone or whatever else? And so no longer is Maiden taking half damage from AoE. But as compensation, she's getting much, much, much more armor and MR to the point where she's now going to be tankier in any generic fighter build. Unless you're building full lethality. If you're building lethality, she's going to be pretty much identical to Daisy and Tibbers. But if you're building health, she's going to be better than Daisy and Tibbers. So against Jax, against a marksman auto-attacking, against any single target damage, this is a 30% effective health increase at most points in time, which is a very, very big deal. But against, Aatrox Qs or other forms of AoE damage is going to be about a 30% reduction in effective health against those things. But again, the shape of this makes total sense and is meant to be pretty reasonable. Now, this probably ends up being a light amount of power positive. If I had to guess, Maiden is probably taking more single target damage than AoE damage, just sort of full stop, but whatever, that's fine. We can always retune as needed down the line. Also a bug fix. Specifically, Yorick's mark triggering was bypassing Shen W. That has been bug fixed here. But all the other parts of Maiden's auto attacks work fine. the League Wiki is out of date in this case, where it says that Maiden doesn't respect blind. It's actually not true. Teemo hard counters Maiden because he gets the extended minion blind duration against Maiden, and so the Teemo blind is the duration of the cooldown. Teemo can permablind Maiden, by the way. I'm not saying that's actually a good counter. I'm pretty sure Teemo gets just hard fucked by Yorick E, but she's really good against Maiden, or he's really good against Maiden. Anyway, regardless, all the other rules around Maiden respect the dodge and blind respectively. Okay. There is still meant to be, though, a nerf to Yorick itself, and this is the bonus damage on E. This is the ghouls. The next 8 attacks deal 30% bonus damage. This will be the next 8 attacks deal 20% bonus damage. We might choose to go harder here, but realistically, if we hit minus 1% win rate on Yorick, this puts his Emerald plus win rate below 50%, which to me is fine. He's low elo skewed. That's just the case here. But one thing I do also want to bring up is some possible future plans for Yorick. I think right now Yorick is not incentivized to be in melee range, and it's why his builds are very, very lethality. And so I think there are some moderately high scope, but relatively easy to do changes to reinforce Yorick as a primary juggernaut who is fighting alongside his ghouls, not just sending them at you like a, lethality mage. Not suggesting 0.5 here. Obviously, not suggesting 0.6 here, but, as early as 0.7, maybe, that's still maybe optimistic, but some future plans possible for Yorick here to re-up his bruiser fighter juggernaut playstyle. Final champion change here is to Zac. We're going to do a damage reshape on the W. Essentially, Zac jungle is pretty much perfectly balanced. Zac top is a little bit OP. He's about a 52% win rate top laner, which, again, some champs can sustain this and it's fine. Maokai has been a 50% win rate top laner, and people have been okay with it in the past. Zac, a little bit too good, a little bit too immovable. So nerfing Zac top lane, trying to preserve overall Zac jungle win rate. This is +5 base damage on W. Zac jungle maxes the second, so this is a strict buff up until champion level 8, and then it's flat, and then at champion level 10 and beyond, it's a small nerf. Zac top maxes ability first, so it's a buff levels 1 through 3, then it's equal at 4, and it's a nerf levels 5 and onwards, which is clearly going to be win rate negative if your nerf takes only to level 5 to kick in. Now, statistically, Zac E max in top lane is reasonably performant. I assume that is only in the range matchups where Zac is already doing pretty well. So Zac is going to be a better anti-ranged champion, which is probably okay. But hey, worth calling out, that's probably going to be happening here with the changes. So that is a very long, 100-minute long patch preview. Went on for a while. Thanks for watching. See you next time, everyone. Bye-bye.